It is very, very good to be with you today. It is very, very nice to be back on Parliament Hill after many, many, many weeks of lockdown. I'm in Toronto on the traditional territories of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. And we have been in lockdown for quite some time. It was just lifted a few days ago. So it is very nice to be back and very nice to be with you, Paul, today. Particularly on this day, as we mark the very solemn and commemoration of the COVID pandemic being named as such. We have been now in this situation of pandemic for over a year now. And today is a day for us to think about and to reflect on what has been lost, what has been sacrificed, the courage that we have seen, the resilience that we have seen, the millions of small and large honorable gestures that people have made all over Canada and all across the world to protect their neighbors, to protect their communities, to support each other. We each have our stories. In my case, some will know that my father died in long-term care avoidably during this pandemic. And so today is a day that I'm thinking of him and my family and my mother, who just received, she is 84, and has just received, oh my goodness, she will be 85 this month, and she just received her first jab. So I'm thinking about her today. I'm thinking about those that are still waiting for their vaccinations. I'm thinking about him. And I'm still thinking about now. I'm thinking about those who still remain unprotected, those who are still at risk, those who still are vulnerable, who are still falling through the cracks. And our commitment, Paul's, our caucus, my own, our parties, is to ensure that every day and in every way we can, that we are highlighting those stories, that we are working cooperatively wherever we can, and holding the government accountable when it is necessary to make sure that everyone is protected until the very end, and that no one unnecessarily falls through the cracks. And also today is the day for us and for everyone who understands all that has been lost, all that has been sacrificed during this period, to talk about how we can pay tribute to that by making sure that the future is better and the future is brighter, and that the lessons we have learned will not be forgotten, and that those lives will not have been lost in vain. This is my personal commitment, and it should be the commitment of everyone who is in a position to make sure that we have a more complete social safety net, that we have better protections, and that we ensure people can live in dignity. Alors aujourd'hui, c'est une journée de marquer le début de la pandémie COVID-19. C'est un jour solemne. C'est une journée de noter tout qui a été sacrifié, tout qui a été perdu, les vies qui ont été perdues, mais aussi de célébrer tous les gestes de courage, de résilience, de générosité que nous avons été témoins pendant la pandémie. Moi, je suis très inspirée de toutes les actions que les personnes ici et autour du monde ont fait pour protéger leur communauté et leurs voisins. Et je les remercie pour leur leadership. Et pour moi, je dis que le travail maintenant, c'est d'abord assurer que pendant la pandémie, et nous sommes encore dans une pandémie, que toutes les personnes au Canada seront protégées le plus possible, que personne tombe dans les trous, dans les lacunes qui existent encore dans notre filet social, que nous préparons dès maintenant pour une relance verte et une relance qui assure que tout le monde au Canada peut vivre une vie de dignité, peut vivre une vie dans un pays avec un filet social complet. Je pense aujourd'hui à ma mère qui a perdu son mari il y a presque un an. Il est mort dans un centre de soins de longue durée, exactement parce qu'il y a encore des faillites dans nos systèmes. Et je pense à tous les autres qui ont perdu leurs proches pendant la pandémie. Et je leur fais la promesse solemne, et Paul aussi, et notre caucus et notre parti, que nous allons faire tout ce qui est nécessaire maintenant et après la pandémie pour protéger leur vie, pour assurer une vie de dignité. And with that, I think that is the perfect segue into what we are here to discuss today. Thanks very much to Paul's leadership in the House of Commons in raising the alarm bells early and frequently on the affordable housing crisis in this country and the twin crisis of homelessness. We have been able to hopefully and will continue to keep this issue on the agenda because we had a crisis before and the crisis has only gotten worse with time. It has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And what was urgent before is now just a 3-alarm fire. And we are going to do all that we can to point out who is being left behind and how we can take better care of them. In that regard, today we are here to announce one of a number of measures that we will be announcing and proposing over the next number of days as we continue to highlight these twin crises. Today we are calling on the government to urgently address the mounting rental arrears and evictions crisis in this country by immediately implementing a residential tenant support benefit. An RTSB, a residential support benefit. This benefit is urgently needed because we know that many people across the country live in housing precarity. We know that many people, even before the pandemic, were living in unaffordable housing or inadequate housing. In Toronto Centre, the riding that I'm seeking to represent, we have neighborhoods where more than 55% of the residents are living in unaffordable and inadequate housing. We also know that women and low-income workers, marginalized people, racialized people have been particularly impacted by job loss and income loss during this pandemic. And these are exactly the same groups of people that are most likely to be renters. And so this is the perfect storm. Unaffordable housing, decades of lack of investment, a pandemic, job loss, income loss. And what it has meant is that people are falling further and further behind. What it has meant is that those people who have fallen further behind have no reasonable prospects of ever catching up. And once we are out of the pandemic, once the final moratoriums are lifted and there aren't that many left, we can expect to see what we have already started to see, which is a wave of potentially unprecedented evictions across this country. Now, there are those, of course, who have had an adequate income replacement from first the CERB and then from the CRB that replaced it. But many people, particularly in dense urban areas where already the rents are extremely high, it has simply not been adequate. Again, in the riding of Toronto Centre, a one-bedroom apartment easily costs over $2,000. And so if you're a young mother with a family of 3 and you have a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, obviously a $2,000 a month payment is not going to be enough. And so these are the people that we're thinking of now. These are the people that are at risk. These are the people, some of whom have already lost their housing, but we know that there are many, many more to come. And we are joining with housing advocates. We are joining with the National Right to Housing Association. We are joining with the CERA in order to say this is the time for the government to act on an urgent basis. Specifically, what we're looking for here is to ensure that 2 things. First, that those who, even after having received the available pandemic supports, find themselves with decreased affordability, are experiencing a decreased affordability, we want to make sure that they qualify for an additional benefit payment to ensure that they are whole. Obviously, there would be a cap on this. We also want to make this retroactive because, as we said, the arrears have been mounting now in some cases for up to a year. So the retroactive nature and the making whole of those who have experienced an income loss or a job loss that makes it impossible for them to keep up with their rent is what we're seeking. Now, there will be those who say that this is a matter of provincial jurisdiction. We can enter into all of the different reasons why we disagree, that it is simply a matter of provincial jurisdiction, but I will just highlight two, and then I will pass it to Paul for his comments. I will make the same comments in French as well, perhaps after Paul has spoken. First, we know that under the National Housing Strategy that Canada has recognized access to adequate housing as a fundamental human right. We have also recognized that we have obligations under international law to ensure access to adequate housing. And so twinning those two things together, the federal government not only has the opportunity, but the obligation to act. Secondly, we know that the government during the pandemic, the federal government, has in fact involved itself in areas that are traditionally provincial jurisdiction. In the case of commercial rents and commercial tenancies, that of course also is an area of provincial jurisdiction. However, the government has provided direct supports to commercial landlords and commercial tenants, and rightly so, during this pandemic. And so I would suggest that it is both intellectually and also morally incoherent to provide benefits to one set of provincial tenants and not to another set, particularly when we're talking about the most vulnerable. So this is something that we would like to see the government implement today. It is certainly something we would support. It is the kind of benefit that I think should be able to receive a strong cross-partisan support for exactly the same reason that the other benefits did. And so we are calling for that today. It will be the first of many calls. Paul, maybe you want to jump in at this point and share just always the experiences of people within your community and also why this is an issue that you've been highlighting for some time.
Sure. Thank you, Annamie. I'm coming from the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation, and my riding is in the traditional territory of the Nanawas, Nanaimo, Staminas, and Liaxin First Nations. And housing affordability is a real crisis in my community, as is homelessness. I am the housing critic for the Green Party, and I hear from people across the country about housing affordability issues. And the pandemic has only made things worse when people are getting an income replacement that doesn't match what they were earning before. That just exacerbates the situation for people. And we have structural issues that we need to fix. So this is a quick fix, a Band-Aid to help people immediately so that we don't have evictions across the country. But we've had a structural issue in housing for a long time. And we've had, governments that have allowed our housing market to be used as a place for laundering money, as a place for a tax haven for the world's wealthy elite who want to hide their wealth. And that has created huge problems. In Vancouver, it's the second most expensive city to live in the world. And Toronto is not far behind. And that has had a ripple effect right across the country. And it's definitely had a ripple effect in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith because people are having to leave Vancouver to find a more affordable place to live. So there are structural issues that we need to fix, and we need to work with the provinces on this issue. Last night, I was in a debate talking about having a national strategy for COVID and why we didn't follow the model of Australia or New Zealand or Taiwan or South Korea. And I was told by the government parliamentary secretary that they didn't want to have a constitutional crisis. 21,000 people have died in this pandemic. We're in an economic crisis. We are racking up billions of dollars worth of debt. And it is a sad and sorry state to hear that the provinces and the federal government cannot get along enough to deal with these crises, to work together for the good of Canadians. And this is the same situation when it comes to housing. Canada has signed on to the UN Declaration of Human Rights and to other conventions that say that housing is a human right. And that is what the National Housing Strategy Act says as well. So we have a responsibility as a federal government to ensure that we work with the provinces to make sure that people have that right to housing.
Thank you very much, Paul. Absolutely. I can't see any reason that this should be polemical, that this should be controversial. We have recognized all along that we were going to encounter holes, gaps, things that we hadn't fully considered, things that we were going to need to catch up and make sure that we fix. Now, we're not going to get started on what a guaranteed livable income might have meant, right, Paul? We'll save that for the next one. But in the absence of that, and we're looking forward to the day that we have that as well, but in the absence of that, there are real and urgent needs that continue to evolve as the pandemic evolves. We do not want to see what is being called again by housing advocates a retrogression, where communities that were already struggling, communities that were just starting to maybe get ahead a little bit before the pandemic, are now falling backwards into a hole that they're not going to be able to get out of. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes ici, moi et Paul, et notre caucus et notre parti, pour demander que le gouvernement crée d'une manière urgente une prestation pour les locataires résidentiels, pour assurer qu'ils ne tombent pas dans des situations d'urgence à cause des arrières dans leur logement. Les deux crises jumelles de notre avant la pandémie, dans le logement abordable et aussi le manque de logement, tout ça est maintenant beaucoup plus soulevé faute à la pandémie. Alors, on sait que les femmes, les groupes marginalisés, les personnes racisées, les peuples autochtones ont été fort touchés par la pandémie. Ils ont perdu leur emploi, ils ont perdu beaucoup de leurs revenus. Et ce sont aussi ces gens qui vivent dans les logements comme locataires. Ce sont exactement ces groupes qui maintenant se trouvent dans des situations où ils risquent d'être forcés de leur logement car ils ont des arrières importants dans leur logement, dans les paiements pour leur logement. Alors, nous sommes ici pour joindre avec les militants, avec la société civile, pour dire que c'est le moment pour le gouvernement fédéral pour reconnaître que le PCU et les autres remplacements ne sont pas suffisants pour assurer que tout le monde peut garder leur logement. On sait surtout dans les centres urbanisés que les gens payent beaucoup plus que les paiements qu'ils reçoivent du gouvernement en ce moment. Alors, on dit qu'il faut avoir un supplément, il faut avoir une prestation créée exactement pour ces populations vulnérables et en risque. L'idée, c'est de créer une prestation qui va mettre les gens ici en 2021 et en 2020 aux mêmes positions où ils étaient en 2019 avant le déclenche de la pandémie. Et pour assurer que s'il y a maintenant une différence entre le revenu actuel et le revenu en 2019, que le gouvernement va leur offrir une prestation pour couvrir la différence. Pour ceux qui disent que c'est une question de juridiction et c'est une question pour les provinces, je dis avec Paul que oui, les provinces ont un rôle à jouer, mais le gouvernement fédéral, eux aussi, ils ont un rôle à jouer. Nous avons déjà reconnu qu'il y a un droit fondamental à l'accès à un logement ADK. Nous avons aussi reconnu que nous avons des responsabilités dans le droit international. En plus, on sait que le gouvernement a déjà offert des prestations pour les locataires commerciaux pendant la pandémie. Alors, si le gouvernement fédéral est capable de le faire pour les locataires commerciaux, ils sont aussi tout à fait capables de le faire pour les plus vulnérables de notre société. Et nous avons fait un promis, nous comme les autres partis, d'être là jusqu'au but pour tout le monde ici au Canada pendant la pandémie. Aujourd'hui, on offre une autre solution pour assurer que nous serons. Et on invite, comme toujours, tous les partis de joindre avec nous dans un esprit de collaboration, de coopération, pour le faire d'une manière unifiée et rapide. C'est exactement le type de prestation que nous avons créé au début de la pandémie. On a besoin de continuer de penser d'une manière très innovateur pour assurer que les gens soient protégés. Voici une autre solution. Et Paul, was there anything else you wanted to add before we take some questions?
No, I could get into the structural issues for quite a while, but I'll leave it there.
This is one of many. As I said, we will be proposing other solutions. We are consulting very closely with housing advocates, with housing rights groups. I want to especially today thank the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation and the National Right to Housing Network for their excellent report proposing concrete solutions after having consulted with well over 100 advocacy organizations, housing organizations, people living the experience of precarious housing. I want to thank them very much for their work today. And of course, Paul, there will definitely be more to come. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions if we have any today.
We will now proceed with the question period. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up. Nous allons maintenant procéder à la période de questions. Une question et une question suivie. Nous allons commencer au téléphone. Opératrice, avons-nous une question?
Merci. Thank you. Please press star one at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There will be a brief pause while the participant register for questions. Il y aura un court délai vous permettant de vous enregistrer dans la file d'attente pour la période de questions. Thank you for your patience. Merci de patienter. There are no questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons pas de questions pour le moment. I would now like to turn the meeting back over to you, Philip.
Thank you. We'll now proceed with the in the room.
Hi, Madam Paul. Welcome back to Ottawa. David Thurton, CBC News. How would this work? Because incomes and rents vary across the country, whether you live in Toronto or Fort Vermilion. So how would this work for just, communities that have different levels of rent, and what's expensive in one part of the country is not expensive in another part of the country?
That's right, and good to see you, David. Nice to be back. This is not like the CERB or the CRB. It is not a one-size-fits-all. This is really intended to acknowledge that there are many different housing situations across the country. As I said, 2019 is the baseline, and the benefit that we are proposing is one that would make people whole with respect to where they were in 2019, before the pandemic, before the job loss, before the income loss. We acknowledge, and of course it's important to acknowledge that the CERB and now the CRB have done much of what they were expected to do and intended to do, which is to ensure that people could cover their basic needs, including their housing. But that has been uneven. In some parts of the country, as you said, it has resulted in an income boost, and certainly it has allowed people to cover their housing needs easily. In other parts of the country, particularly urban environments that we know that were already extremely unaffordable, and where people were paying far more than $2,000 a month just for a one or two bedroom apartment, it has not been enough, and it has not been sufficient. That payment has not been sufficient to make people whole again and to keep their income to rent ratio in line with what it was before the pandemic. So what we are saying is that with an income cap incorporated into it, we would want to make people whole as to where they were in 2019, where it is needed, and we want to make it retroactive because we know that people already have entered into various very serious holes of debt.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, this rent benefit would vary based on places and income. And just the follow-up that I wanted to ask, So oftentimes when we see in communities where there is some sort of benefit, maybe it's from an employer for living expenses, because some places in Canada are very expensive to live. I could think of if you live up north in Iqaluit, your employer might kick in some extra money for rent or for accommodations. But what we see in communities is the landlords jack up the rent. Because people are getting this, top up from their employer or this extra benefit. So how do you prevent rent inflation with this policy?
Just to underline again, this is first, it's bespoke. This is not a one size fits all. It's not a recreation of the CERB where it's the same amount of money across the entire country. We're talking about looking at each person in their situation, in their community, and determining what they need to bridge the gap between the income that they have now and the income they had prior to the pandemic, and to keep the ratio the same. There is, of course, an income cap. There is, of course, a cap on the amount of rent as well. It's not intended and not intended to be gamed. And the way that it is designed, it would not be able to be gamed. We're looking again retroactively at where people were at 2019. 2019 is the baseline. 2019 is the baseline. So the scenario that you're describing, people are very creative, of course, and of course, any system that's proposed, I would never suggest that it's impossible that someone might figure out a way to benefit from it. But because we have identified 2019 as the baseline, the pre-pandemic rental year, anything that happens after that has to be in reference to that. And it is not intended to fund luxury apartments. It is intended to be capped at a particular rent, depending on where you are in the country. It's intended to be capped at a particular income as well. And so this is something really focused on low-income, vulnerable people who were renting, in some cases already unaffordably, in other cases perhaps affordably, who no longer are able to, and bridging the gap between where they were before the pandemic, where they are now, and looking to make them whole. And I'm happy to share, we will, Paul, go ahead in a second. We will be sharing more specific details about the formula and the proposal later today. And I would also highly recommend that everyone take a look at the report that was prepared by Sarah, as I said, the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, and the National Right to Housing Network. They have put forward, I think, a very credible proposal that has thought through many of those regional differences. Paul?
Yeah, I could just follow up. I think this is a really important point, David. First of all, this program is meant to help people with arrears. So what their rent would have already been established, and this is to make sure that they're not evicted because they're short in paying rent during the pandemic. But the point that you bring up is super important because we have a lot of predatory investors in the housing market right now who are buying up affordable housing units and doing cosmetic renovations, either renovictions where there's rent control or where there's no rent control in provinces like New Brunswick, where they're just jacking up the rent by 50, 80, or 100% without doing any renovations. And in northern communities like Yellowknife, one of these real estate investment trusts controls 75% of the apartments. And we have a high rate of homelessness in communities like that because the apartments, there's a preferential treatment for government employees and for resource extraction companies. And the locals are having trouble affording the rates that these apartments are jacked up to. And so you have a lot of Indigenous people who can't afford rent. And then because there's such a control over the rental market, people get blacklisted and can't rent anywhere. And so it's a serious problem. We have predatory investors in our housing market, and we cannot build affordable units fast enough in this country to deal with what's happening in the affordable housing market right now. And so one of the things I've been calling for is the government to invest in nonprofit and cooperative housing, and to actually buy up some of the affordable housing stock and facilitate its purchase by nonprofit and co-op housing organizations. So it's something that it's a serious issue we need to deal with.
to really emphasize again, David, we're talking about the urgent solutions of now while we are still in this pandemic. This was not intended, nor will it ever be a solution that, to all of our affordable housing and homelessness challenges. This is something to make sure that at this moment in time, people are protected while we do the work, which is long overdue, in creating a proper national housing strategy that addresses the structural issues that Paul mentioned. I'm very excited. The order is a bit different today, but I know Senator Pate was in an important meeting before this. But I do want to, since you are here, just invite you up to the podium to perhaps make a couple of remarks. I don't know how much of what has been said you caught, but please, if you wouldn't mind just coming up to say a couple of quick words.
I'll just quickly say to David, too, I tabled motion 66 in the House of Commons, and if you check that out, it covers a lot of these structural issues.
No, thank you very much, and thank you for for inviting me to join you. I agree, there is an urgent need right now. The pandemic has laid bare inequities, but there is also an urgent need to ensure that we work towards long-term sustainable goals so that we don't continue the acute homelessness and the acute inequalities that have been, laid bare. For those who weren't aware of them before, many of us unfortunately were aware of them before, and so I certainly support this move. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone had any questions for the senator. Anyone?
Pour le fond, opératrice, avons-nous une question?
There are no questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons pas de questions pour le moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And yes, I'm about to do this. Yes, I'm about to indulge myself. But people in Canada are getting to know me, and one of the things that you should know about me is that I am a mother. Je suis une mère. Oui, je suis politicienne, mais oui, je suis aussi d'abord et surtout une mère. Today is my son's 17th birthday. And I'm just thrilled. There are so many terrible things about the pandemic, but one of the silver linings is that I actually on a weekday get to be with my son. Jonas, come here. This is highly unorthodox, but again, if we are going to have different kinds of people in politics, then we're going to do things a little different every once in a while. So I just
Happy birthday
come.
to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jonas. Happy birthday to you.
Okay. There we go. As we said, different people, right? Different people in politics. We're going to do it a bit different. We're switching it up a bit. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. I think is that it for questions? Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. And thank you, Senator Pate, for being with us.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. C'est ce qui m'a fait à la conférence de presse. Merci.